Hello. Welcome one and all to the Institute of Risk Management Midlands Regional Group session today on corporate governance and the management of risk. I'd like to offer my huge thanks to my committee colleagues Sharon Condola and Susan Howlett, and to our host today Paul Smith of Ernst & Young for their huge efforts to put this together. And my thanks to our panellists for giving up their time to talk to us all today. Today's subject is, of course, very timely. I'm sure it's not really news to anyone that there have been a couple of unusual changes and challenges this year. It's confronted everyone with novel situations, rapid adjustments, and there's no sign that the pace of change is ever going to let up. In times like this, it's all the more important that businesses are resilient, prepared, and able to make the right decisions about risk. And sound governance is absolutely critical to that. It'll be ever more important for the rest of this current crisis as we move into a new normal. In today's session, we're going to be talking about corporate governance and the management of risk. Specifically, we're going to look at UK corporate reform and particularly the implications of the introduction of a UK version of the US's Sarbanes-Oxley regime. We'll delve into the impact on business and how risk is assessed, and we'll look at how COVID has changed our approach and fast-track change. I'm sure it's going to be an insightful and exciting discussion, and I hope all the attendees are going to get as much out of this as I know I am. A little housekeeping to start. For any non-members who are joining us today, welcome. You are perfectly free to attend this session and indeed a couple more without joining, but we hope you will join to keep gaining the benefits that membership can offer, including these sessions and more. Just to let all attendees know, we will be recording the whole session today to help keep it available for forum members who aren't able to join us and for everyone to refresh themselves afterwards if they wish. If you do have any questions you'd like to ask our panel, please feel free to send them along by chat as we go along through the session, and there'll be another opportunity to pose questions after the panel session when we go into the Q&A at the end. Now, can I introduce you to Paul Smith of Ernst & Young, our chair for today's webcast? Paul, would you like to introduce yourself and our speakers for today?
Thank you very much, Chris. Yeah, very excited to be here. As you said, I'm from Ernst & Young partner, and I suppose my focus is very much on data and data governance, things like that. So for me, I think seeing how UK corporate reform and those things sort of impact on that would be really interesting. So I'm really keen to speak to our panelists. So it'd be great just to introduce our panelists. And first of all, we've got Neil Mather, fellow of mine at EY. Would you like to say hello, Neil?
Absolutely. Hello. Good morning, everyone. Neil Mather, partner with EY. Really excited to be here, as Paul said. I lead our SOX and internal controls consulting practice in the UK. Bit of a mouthful there. In terms of my background, chartered accountant is where I started off my life, but moved very quickly into the world of risk management, internal audit, and internal controls. And now been leading a number of large engagements globally to help our clients think about what does SOX mean, but what does UK corporate reform mean? So we'll be talking to you a little bit more about that later on. Thanks, Paul.
Brilliant, Neil. Thank you very much. And Heather.
Hello, good everybody. It's great to be here today. Heather Richardson. I'm the Head of Group Compliance and Assurance for Severn Trent PLC. Prior to Severn Trent, I've worked across private and public sector, undertaking strategy, policy, transformation and business development roles, so quite a broad background prior to more landing in the assurance and compliance space. I'm also a board director and vice president for the UK's largest independent cooperative. So on that capacity, I also serve on the Audit and Risk Committee and the Origination Committee, and I'm also a trustee of their community fund. And just a quick thing in advance, I do own dogs, and so you may get them joining the presentation at some stage as well.
Sounds good. Thank you, Heather. And Socrates, I'm very disappointed you're not wearing your bow tie as we have on the photo there, but if you'd like to introduce yourself too.
Yeah, that was a lovely photo from years ago. Yes, thank you very much. Thanks, Paul. Socrates Koudinaris, for those who are members of the IRM, you may know me from that lovely photo there. So I am the ex-past chairman of the board of the IRM. I was on the board for about 7 years. More recently, I'm a co-chair of a specialist interest group that we set up during lockdown, started in February. The specialist interest group has to do with NEDs and CROs coming together. So I'd like to offer sort of my view on that in our conversation later today. A bit of background, 20+ years of experience, both insurance and risk management, fellow of the Chartered Insurance Institute, fellow of the IRM, and for my day job, I look after the EMEA risk management for a company called Reinsurance Group of America. Over to you, Paul.
Thank you, Socrates. So I think everybody will see that we've got a great panel of people in front of us, so we should have a great discussion, and so very pleased to be the chair today so I can ask those exciting questions. So I'd like to kick off with you, Neil. I think we talk about UK corporate reform. It's obviously a new thing around risk. It's going to have an impact on us as organisations. It'd be great to get a bit more insight into why it's being introduced and what it means for UK business.
Yeah, no, absolutely, Paul. I think from my perspective, it's really important to look backwards before we can look forward. And what's been the genesis around why we're talking about UK corporate reform, UK SOX in 2020? And it's pretty clear to see that if you look at marketing thought leadership material, the genesis of all of this really goes back to the financial crisis of 2007 and 8. We all went through it. We all had different perspectives and experience of how we got through it. But interestingly, two things really stood clear to me. Number one, there was definitely a lack of trust in the capital markets at that time. And I think the second piece for me that really stood out was the societal expectation gap between what society thinks, but also their views on big audit firms, big companies, big regulators. And that societal gap really started to manifest itself back then. If you then just fast forward a few years into 2014 and 15, what you started to see was more of these corporate governance failures, accounting scandals, internal control failures. And the names such as Patisserie Valerie, Carillion, etc. became very common in the media. I don't know about you, but it felt at a point in time there was one of these appearing every few months, with a lot of media sensationalism around it. But actually, when you started to underpin some of the root causes behind those, there was some internal control and risk issues fundamentally that weren't working. And I think on the back of all of those things together, the UK government had to do something about it. And that they did. And so the UK government launched commissioned a number of reviews that took place. And I'm going to focus on three of them. And the three main ones being the Kingman Review of the FRC, the audit regulator. The second one being the CMA review of the audit market and the perceived lack of competitiveness of it. And thirdly, the Bryden review on the future of audit. A number of these reviews have now reported into the market, and those documents are publicly available. But there are some key themes that are coming through in what they've been reporting in terms of things like management accountability or the lack of. There was a lot of talk about, auditor involvement or lack of. What were management doing around their risk management framework or their fraud risk assessment or their internal control framework? So these are the common themes we were seeing, and we'll come on to those in a minute. But on the slide in front of you, what you see here is in December 2019, Bryden in particular published his findings. And there was a real statement of fact around management accountability and internal control. It was followed by that a strong statement from the government about moving that forward into some kind of legislation. But lo and behold, obviously our year changed. COVID came about shortly afterwards, and we've still got Brexit bubbling on in the background. But what we do know today is that a consultation period is due to kick off very shortly, which all of us are enabled to participate and actively participate to start thinking about what that would look like. Now, Paul, two questions that have come in and people ask me the most is, when is this going to land, and who does it apply to? And if I'm really honest with you, I don't have the answers to either of those questions, which doesn't make me a very good panelist at all. But I can give you my sense of where that is heading. I think you really have to look back in terms of the journey of US SOX that many of us have been through. In terms of the legislation, what we're hearing in terms of the mood music is that some kind of legislation post the consultation, subject to COVID and everything else, would land sometime in the back or end of 2021. Now, if you do look at the learnings of SOX in the US, what happened there was the legislation landed and companies were given some time to then think about it and then recognize what needs to be done before they were compliant. And you could see, in my own view, a world where listed companies, or FTSE 100, where it has started, and maybe larger organizations as well, and really having to think about what does that risk and control framework look like. So I'll pause there, Paul. I hope that kind of gives you a sense of the direction of travel and where this has been coming from. think, Paul, you're on.
The key thing I'm hearing there is that.
There you go.
Yeah. So the key thing I've been hearing there, I think, is that this is not new. It's been bubbling along for a little while, so we've had a bit of time to get used to it. And I think, Heather, it'd be good to just hear from you in terms of, this isn't a surprise. So what have internal audit and the board been doing, almost in getting your act together or in mind around this new challenge?
Thanks, Paul and Neil. So as you say, it's not a surprise, and we've been thinking about what this means to us over the last year, including sort of flagging it up to our board early that it's going to be coming, with all the caveats that Neil just said about we're not entirely sure when. So we have been thinking about it. I suppose for Severn Trent and for a number of other companies, we've actually been increasing our non-financial reporting over the last while anyway. So in part to reflect the focus and activities that we actually undertake as part of our social purpose and looking at those. But it's also true to say that in the water sector, in particular, we have been seeing a change in desire for this kind of information. And also we've been under increasing requirement to get board backing on that. But it's not just our regulators that we're seeing that actually wants this. You know, we're seeing that there is a greater need from customers. We're seeing in the media there is more aspects of things coming, and also shareholders are increasingly looking at this, and particularly on the environmental and sustainability side of it in their thinking. So in terms of internal audit and the board, it's really important that we've started to look at this, build it into our plans and activities now, and that's certainly what we've been starting to look at and do.
Sounds good. So some good preparation, some mental. Nice picture from Socrates there. Some good sort of thinking in the background, and I suppose for me the accountability point sort of comes through nicely there in terms of, you know, this is a little bit more about people being more accountable. I think, Socrates, what are you seeing from a sort of cultural point of view in terms of people reacting to that?
Great, thank you, Paul, and thank you, Neil and Heather, and thank you, Neil, for sort of giving us a bit of a rundown in the past decade. So I'm going to give a bit of an IRM's view of a rundown of the past decade and put some best practice out there. So I don't know whether, you know, lots of panelists and obviously attendees, but about 10 years ago, the IRM published a document. It was a guidance document called Risk Culture Under the Microscope, a Guidance for Boards. So it's quite interesting to sort of walk that 10 years and see all the corporate failures that didn't really read that guidance document. But what that guidance document has 5 key points, which I'd just like to put to the audience here and strengthen how a positive culture and a positive organization would not fail without, you know, the caveat that doesn't mean that they won't fail for other reasons. But the UK corporate reform for those companies shouldn't come as a surprise to them. Because if they have a successful risk culture in place, then they are following quite a few positive principles. And these 5 are, no surprise, tone from the top, and we can discuss that later on from a COVID implication. The commitment to ethical principles of that company and that organization, so how it behaves and how it acts, but also that clear accountability and drive and ownership on specific issues and risks in their organization. And the word transparency, which we use quite loosely, but quite important words, from a timely dissemination of information, both internally and externally. These are all sort of key drivers. But finally, the actual culture that prevails. So what is actually done in that organization when the lights are off and no one's looking? So bad news, you know, comes to the fore, goes all the way up, goes all the way down and outwards. So they're not afraid to communicate bad news or to apportion that blame without fear of apportioning that blame. But also a learning organization that seeks to understand its own mistakes, its near misses, and takes that as a positive sign to strengthen and better themselves. So this encourages appropriate risk behaviors, appropriate risk taking, and appropriate culture, and challenging inappropriate behaviors. So as a concluding point to this sort of section of the conversation, it's all about the people, right? And the people are at the heart of the organization. So how they behave 24/7 influences how the company will, you know, positively or negatively impact later on. So UK corporate reform, it's back to culture in my point of view.
Yeah, and it's really nice to just think, I suppose for people listening today, it's really important to listen. It's really important to understand what this is all about and why. Because as you say, if we believe in it and we want to do it and we're open in terms of the way we talk about, as you say, the failures, the successes, the need to be better and improve things, then that, you know, that can make a real difference. And as you say, that's something that if we can get that right, we'll pretty much be done. But ever the challenge. So Neil, I suppose just picking up on that and sort of thinking about that then more, because we've brought the people side more at an operational level. Be good to understand that from a sort of practical point of view, and also, I suppose, perhaps drawing on some of the differences between the UK and the US approach to this.
Yeah, no, absolutely, Paul. This has been a big topic of discussion, especially for the last couple of years, especially when the phrase US UK SOX came about, and people were wondering, you know, what does that mean and how does it compare to the US? Because I think some of us might be old enough to remember it the very first time. And I know me as an auditor, as an accountant and a risk management professional, it was painful. You know, it was not pragmatic. It was very much enforced. And I think, you know, we now have the benefit of hindsight to look at that. And if I then kind of step back and look at the reviews that we talked about earlier, the government reviews, there are a number of themes that came out of them, which is driving what a potential UK approach could look like. You can see them on the screen in front of you, but I'll just pick up on a couple of those there. The key one there for me is broadening assurance to close the expectation gap. So I talked earlier about that societal gap between society, big firms, big auditors, and big regulators. And I think if you're somebody who is in, you know, a member of society like we all are, you know, the external perception is actually the one assurance product they see is the audit report. Now, we all know that there are a host of other assurance mechanisms that are underpinning an organisation: internal audit, risk management, you know, health and safety reviews, and the list can go on. And very much the theme of these reviews is how do you kind of bring a better alignment around those, but also more visibility of what is happening in the organisation. So one of the things that came out was, how do you talk to your shareholders at the AGM about your audit plan or your risk assessment, just to give people a broader understanding of what's going on in the organisation. The second one I'm going to pull out here is the importance of internal control, and therefore the need to attest its effectiveness. Now, the importance of internal control has always been a building block of UK PLC. But what Bryden had said in December 2019 was go one step further in terms of that attestation on effectiveness. That's a big shift in mindset and in the way we operate in the UK. That's not something, unless you were US listed or JSOX or Japanese listed, etc., you wouldn't be doing that. So that's a big shift in mindset. And then the point that Heather made earlier about the importance of non-financial KPIs and APMs, or alternative performance measures. And this is an interesting area. So we all know that US SOX is very much around financial control, internal control over financial reporting. But Bryden is going one step further and is talking about these non-financial KPIs and APMs. What do we mean by those tangibly? Well, if you think about measures that the board are measured by, how are they actually coming up with those? What are the risks around them? What's the assurance over those measures? Are they the right measures? The one around APM is really interesting to me personally. We see a lot of board reports, and I'm sure Heather, Socrates, you see the same thing here about culture, diversity, inclusion statistics that are just thrown out there into the market. And the question that's being asked is, what's the assurance around those? You know, how do we ensure the completeness and accuracy? Forgive me for SOX terminology, but how do you ensure the completeness and accuracy of those? And so what you're seeing now in the UK is a direction of travel to look at not just financial control, but broader than that. And the other point I'll point out here is fraud. So again, a big cornerstone is to UK PLC and our corporate governance legislation. But I think what we're now talking about is making that more tangible and more real. It's not enough to say, I tick a box to do a fraud risk assessment. I need to be looking at that in more detail. What are the measures I as management are putting in place? And Paul, you know, you and I work in an audit firm. You know, we're seeing the other side of the coin there in terms of us having to think about fraud from an audit perspective. So whilst there are some similarities with US SOX, there is a bit of a direction of travel in terms of something that's slightly more or slightly different to adapt to a UK market.
So I think for me, the really key point there is it is much broader. It's going far beyond financial and looking much more at the business itself and how it works and those types of things. So I think, Heather, it'd be great just to get a bit more real insight into some of the real non-financial things that perhaps you're looking at. And I suppose picking up on Neil's point, we don't just want to do this because people think we should. It's more, what are we doing because we should that actually make a difference?
Sure, thank you. I think, as I mentioned earlier, in the water sector, our economic regulator, Ofwat, has increasingly shifted to wanting board oversight on non-financial metrics, and we've seen that. So, for example, just as a bit of context, all water companies sign up to performance commitments in their regulatory business plan, and we report annually to Ofwat and publish those on our website every year. So, and these can be really wide-ranging, and every company has a slightly different number of them. We have over 40 of them, but they cover things such as pollutions and blockages, leakage, not just, how much leakage in terms of the reduction of it, but also our speed in responding to leakage. It includes biodiversity. How do we help vulnerable people to pay their bills? How do we go out and educate people to use water more wisely? So it really is vast in terms of these non-financial metrics that we're seeing increasingly go there. So we're actually now in our 6th year of doing this. So and I suppose to give our stakeholders confidence in these metrics, we also publish our assurance plan every year, detailing how we use our 3 lines of assurance, how our ownership and accountability, our governance and our transparency focus also applies across all of these areas. So it is something that, in terms of readiness for looking as more and more things come, we've got a framework there that we then use to expand across all of these areas in a similar way that we do with our financials. In addition to that, alongside our annual performance report, our board has been required historically, but actually to make a board compliance statement to our regulators as well over this information, which includes statements on the adequacy of controls and the accuracy of the information. But again, it's not, as you said, Paul, it's not just about what we have to do. We've also looked at how can we go further. So how can we continue to build that trust, but also to demonstrate what it is we're actually doing and giving back to the community and to, be our social purpose, particularly with water. It is kind of vital that we have it. So we are looking at that. And the other things are that we are seeing an increase as well in things like exec pay. So over the last couple of years, the requirement has also extended to matters of executive pay, including bonus calculations. And last year, we, while it's not a requirement, we felt it was really important to focus on our sustainability. So we did a standalone sustainability report, and again, have built that into our overall processes that we do in terms of our assurance, accountability, governance frameworks. And I think it is about just understanding all those areas that are right for your organisation and for ours. There's quite a wide range of things, but it's applying it all to them.
It's amazing when you talk there about the huge range of different metrics and different measures. And I suppose the more we're asked to publish these things, it is really important that we publish the right ones, and that these numbers are right. And when people read them, they know they can trust them. I suppose Socrates just made me think about the fact that we all want to be giving the impression we're doing a good job and all these numbers are great, but as Neil said on his previous slide, there's sometimes a bit of a disconnect between our ambition from an assurance point of view and what's really going on and what people are really thinking. What are some of the ways that companies are trying to deal with that and close that gap around the culture side?
Thank you, Paul. So this is a great question, discussed at boards, discussed at the IRM's special interest group, and how do we find out if there is a disconnect between the culture that is described and what is actually in place. So, famous words from Peter Drucker. He once said, what gets measured gets managed, but then what is a golden measure? So what we're actually seeing at this point is putting those metrics in place and maintaining that cadence of reporting. So boards and management, senior management, have put a couple of things in place. So surveying all the staff, asking their opinions, back to my sort of earlier point of open communication, transparency, and receiving information from your staff and acting upon that. That's really a good starting point. Metrics on incident reporting, back to the earlier points. If you're getting incidents, that's good. what are the metrics and what is that telling you? Whistleblowing, of course, are you getting that, and what does that mean? Staff turnover is another metric that is sort of hot on that dashboard, but also diversity and inclusion and all sorts of ESG type of metrics that organization has been putting in place. So quite a lot of metrics, but if you sort of put that all in a dashboard, it's not an easy thing to do, but this is what boards are looking for at this point in time, and making sense of those metrics.
So it really does sound as though we're sort of asking businesses to be much more connected and much more aware of those things going on around them. So, not just my little silo bit, but actually some of these other activities other people are performing are going to have I ought to really know what's going on, so I can be sure that in my bit I'm okay, but equally everybody else is playing their role in this. So yeah, complicated, but definitely an exciting challenge. I suppose Neil, it'd be good to come back to you on that one. That in terms of practical things that people are doing, what are people generally doing that's helping to bring these things together?
So it's an interesting question, Paul. And I guess the way I would group this is maybe into three buckets. So you've got a number of organisations, well, I would say a small group of organisations, maybe similar to Heather and others, who are actually starting to think about this more actively. The board has asked questions, the audit committee has asked questions. And you're seeing a number of organisations now thinking about what does an ICFR improvement programme look like, and taking those first steps to doing that. You then have this large middle section here that are actually maybe taking some, baby steps, dipping their toe into all of it, because a lot of this is still quite theoretical, and really thinking about, what could I be doing, or what should I be doing, and maybe starting some pilot exercises in small parts of their business to think about, the internal control environment, which I'm going to come on to. And then you have a large group of organisations, and I'll be honest, who are not doing anything at the moment. They're really just sitting back and waiting, because obviously the legislation hasn't landed. We're still going through, or about to start, a consultation period. There's a number of macroeconomic, political and economic factors that mean, there isn't a big certainty yet on when this will land. So companies are sitting back and thinking, when is the right time to do that? But if I kind of break down, maybe just talk through a couple of these things of what companies are starting to do, there is this piece about healthcheck. Now, what do I mean by that? Companies are saying to me, and we're talking to them about, do you understand your current state risk and control framework? Do you know where your processes and what your systems look like? And here in UK PLC, the typical answer is maybe, I'm not sure, no, because there hasn't been that strong desire to do that unless you've had some kind of initiative running through your organisation. So we are seeing another organisation take on board this concept of a health check, which we'll talk about later, which is really helping you to understand where you are from a current state. There's a couple of familiar words there around scoping. We've seen some companies start to really do a bit of a SOC scoping on their own organisation, taking the financials, really looking at materiality, looking at qualitative and quantitative risk factors, and thinking about where are the riskier parts of my business. And therefore, if I had to press the button on internal control over financial reporting, where would I start first, and where would I direct my efforts? Then I talk about IT systems, an area close to my heart and your heart, Paul, I know, but really trying to get an understanding of the IT environment. Because again, a number of organisations we've spoken to don't really seem to have a big handle over that entire IT landscape. So really trying to understand, where are those systems? Are there any bespoke systems? Are there any kind of traditional systems? What are the controls around them? How are we managing the risk? Those questions are starting to be had, not just with internal audit and risk professionals, but also questions coming on from CEOs and CFOs. And the only last one I will kind of really highlight here is the one at the very bottom. So it's last but not least, it's engaging with your external auditors on this. Because obviously this is going to impact them as much as it's going to impact you. So engaging with your auditors, talking to them about it, what's their perception of it, where are they going on this? And actually, the more you involve them and the more you communicate with your auditors, it always feels like a better dialogue. And it's about building that relationship. So as you move along on this journey together, you do exactly that. You do this together.
That's really nice. And I think from my point of view as a bit more of a data practitioner, so I like seeing how data flows through the business. It's nice to see on this slide that the idea of getting your head around the idea of where does the data go, what systems does it flow through, where are the controls that touch that, and having that better picture of your business. That's certainly been an ambition of mine for years. So maybe this corporate reform can help push that agenda a bit further and help organisations to start looking at this slightly differently and getting that bigger, broader view of the way the business is constructed, because business is certainly a lot more complicated than it used to be, a lot more third parties, a lot more systems, a lot of stuff that perhaps has been used for years and isn't quite right, and a few bits bolted on, and obviously the cloud is making a huge impact on this as well. Which I think it is nice to see, Socrates, to the fact that a lot of this thing is around sort of discipline, around, I suppose, having good process, rigorous information sort of generated, that sort of stuff. And I suppose if we look at financial services, we often think, well, that tends to be where that starts to happen. And I wondered, from your point of view, Socrates, are there any sort of financial service learnings that we might well see creeping through into the other sectors as people try and address this corporate reform challenge?
Thank you, Paul. So, yeah, very interesting to make that comparison between financial services and non-financial services. So if I speak from an insurance industry standpoint, we've had Solvency II for quite a number of years now. At first, everyone was grappling with it, but there's some positives that have come out of Solvency II. It's given the demarcation from audit and risk, so it requires a separate audit committee and a separate risk committee. It's asking for a head of a risk, chief risk officer role, which is independent from an audit perspective. And that governance sort of permeates throughout the organization, financial services organization, and gives clear roles and responsibility and accountability in that organization. So providing that assurance, as you guys discussed earlier. Not only that, you've got the regulation behind us. So you've got the Financial Conduct Authority, the PRA, the Prudential Authority, constantly coming up with consultation papers and looking at risks and asking the industry to consider quite a few, and I'll point to the data flows, but quite a few elements that could impact a financial services organization. So there's guidance on outsourcing arrangements, on outsourcing to the cloud, ICT and security risk management is really hot on the agenda. And at the moment, operational resilience is sort of making it the #1 on the agenda. So, including countless other regulatory activities and consultation papers. But it's important to note that knowing quite explicitly those data flows, and that's what the regulator is asking financial services organizations. Do you know, have you mapped out your data flows and your critical processes, and do you know those points of failure within your organization? And I guess that kind of points back to this conversation, why the remit.
Yeah, music to my ears again, hearing data flows thing. Thanks very much, Socrates. I'm feeling very, very important and very useful all of a sudden, which is great. But I suppose when we look at that, I mean, it's nice also to see that sort of almost a reappraisal of the segregation of duties thing and making sure we've got the right people in the right places to have the right view and not being unduly biased and that type of thing. But I suppose what this also, with those different committees and I suppose these multitude of different ways of getting assurance, Heather, what sort of challenges are you seeing there in terms of the, as Neil said earlier, you can get assurance in so many different ways and for so many different things. What are you thinking about on that one?
So I suppose just before I sort of really go into that, I think thinking about it from an audit and risk committee perspective, I think one of the things is you often get caught in the approval of the current year aspects, the day-to-day, and you see things coming up. And I think it's always worth, from an audit and risk committee, to think about that horizon scanning and to, again, just having that little bit of time on the agenda. And one of the reasons I say that is because if you want to really balance all of your activities, you need to know the forward-looking horizon that you're balancing it for. And otherwise, you kind of get into this position where you have, excuse my dogs in the background if you can hear them, but you get into this position where you basically have all your data, you go through your 3 lines of your, you get it done, and then you're always seeing it after the event, and you may have a risk that you sometimes have to scurry around and quickly solve there, or you might put it onto, yeah, we can solve that one next year. But if you actually do that horizon scanning, you can think about how do you get it all ready? How do you line up all the right assurers, the right time in advance, so that everybody knows what you're going to be looking at and when? And you can also then really plan that in advance. And I think having that kind of view that goes through to your audit risk committee, that kind of forward planning view, really, really helps in this space, particularly when you talk about the health check, Neil, and things like that, you know, really understanding that and doing your gap analysis on that piece. I think in terms of the actual assurance types then, I suppose examples of where, you know, I've particularly found it useful is rather than having perhaps a third line audit at the end, then you might actually do a findings and recommendations on your framework. And then from that, you might be able to go, do you know what, in this area, I absolutely, when we come to do it, need a do it. Actually, in this area over here, line or self-assured is good enough. And, you know, be brave with that and really balance it. I'm particularly conscious that in the water sector, it's customer money that we're spending on our assurance framework. And so I need to be able to think, could I really justify to our customers that their money is being spent on the areas most important to them and the areas we have to do, and really thinking differently about where do I use audit, where do I use assurance, where do I use findings and recommendations, and where do we go actually ownership in the line, and that self-assessment is good enough to actually do it.
It's nice to hear the ethics even coming through on the audit side of things, actually, because I'm not sure we necessarily imagine that happening. But now it's really nice to think, you know, where do I spend that money? What's the best use of that money that I have to give the assurance I need to the people outside? I was just reflecting back on the slide that you showed earlier, Neil. It was good to see training on there. And I know, Socrates, you as we've seen, you're particularly excited about the culture side of things and the people side of things. I mean, where do you think that training should be focused?
So I was going to draw the analogy from Heather's money from the client's perspective into financial services, where it's all about data. So, you know, an insurance company, all it does is handles data. So if I'm going to look at sort of training in that space, it'll be the data and the data handling of that space. So the privacy, the cyber security, the data governance, and the IT really are the highest elements of risk, where you could lose or, you know, get compromised data. So training in those regards, and, you know, if you don't have an internal function, then getting it from outside help, or if you have a function, maintaining that training and keeping them up to speed is where I would focus on.
And I suppose it was interesting, Socrates, earlier you referred to the risk function as being something that was very much coming through from the Solvency II work and the financial services side. So I suppose, Heather, if we then think about the role of the board and how much it does, you know, how much is being done in a centralized way and in a decentralized way, and that sort of that new composition of people, what's your sort of thought on that? So they're not hearing us. Can you hear us, Heather? Can anyone hear me?
Yep, sorry, apologies. I've had a bit of an IT issue. I couldn't come off mute in terms of
That's
that.
fine.
Yes, in terms of thinking of, as say, around governance and things like that, and I guess one of the key points I'd make here is really about doing what's best for your organisation and culture. And, you know, Socrates said culture is a huge thing in all of what we do. And at Severn Trent, we use a bit of a hybrid culture and structure, with centralised frameworks and oversight and decentralised ownership across governance, risk, compliance and assurance. And even within those functions, it's decentralised. So we have internal audit sits in a different place from, say, compliance and assurance. And enterprise risk management sits in a separate place again. So everything, that all of them have a centralised function with then decentralised structures underneath. I think in mid-counties cooperative, there's a much greater degree of centralisation, and I suppose more a traditional look, if you were to say that, in terms of, you know, where you have your chief risk officer, and underneath that you'd have your health and safety, you've got your internal audit, you have your compliance functions, you have your risk functions all sat in one place. Both of them work. And, you know, in terms of that, I think it's about understanding your overall structure and your culture of each organisation. There isn't a one size fits all, but I think the key point is whatever your structure is, it's a clarity that's needed in where the accountability sits, where the controls are, and making sure that aligns to each step of your governance journey, and having that clarity. So again, at Severn Trent, one of the things we've done is put a number of things in place around our governance. So, you know, we've categorized perhaps groups of our publications, things like that. So does it need a board statement? In which case that will be much more highly controlled by the centralized functions. If it doesn't need a board statement, but it's a big reputational issue, such as sustainability, perhaps, and reporting around there, then actually that might be still collaborated on and significantly controlled by the central functions, but not at the same level. But if it's other things that we're publishing that's just useful, it may be that we just kind of check that teams are using the right frameworks rather than actually having that level of control. So again, it's very much choosing the right organizational structure, the right governance and things through to your board that matches both what you're doing and adapt it through every element of your business. It doesn't, even within your business, it doesn't have to be the same for every single thing you.
Yeah, that sounds really, really good. I like that. Almost best fit for best. And I didn't say that very well, but you know what I mean. And I suppose we couldn't possibly not talk about COVID. I know, Socrates, you know, one of the things we talked about before was the fact that almost COVID has perhaps elevated the need for the board to be engaged on these challenges around sort of resilience and preparedness for eventualities that were previously unheard of. What have you seen in that respect, Socrates?
So the opportunity of having set up the special interest group in February and the meeting during the absolute lockdown of March and was the #1 agenda item. Quite a few non-execs on that first meeting came up with the point of, we never really in the past know much about the staff and their well-being, and that was elevated as the #1 risk or #1 item to look after, the actual staff. How are they themselves, their families, their loved ones? The fact that everyone implemented a BCP, we're still in the BCP mode, is the new normal of working from home, and from a financial services standpoint, we adapted well. But again, how do you maintain operational control? So back to Heather's point, it doesn't matter what structure you have, it's the effectiveness and the assurance piece. How do you do that when you never see anyone? All we do is have Zoom calls and MS Teams calls. So the role of the risk management function at that point, and it's that critical friend, is stepping up, but also the non-execs understanding a few other risks that they never thought about. These are the sort of things that were highlighted during COVID, and you know, this is the new norm now. So when you have a board meeting, you ask about our staff and about the well-being before you even look at the financials of that organization. So it's positive, because this was a bigger stress test to any organization, and how we're faring through it. Just a few things just to put on the agenda.
No, it's really nice to, as I suppose, as an employee, to almost feel that and experience that. And it's interesting how pervasive that's become in terms of, often when we're asked to sort of support clients on some work, quite often the questions will come our way that say, can you talk about how you look after your staff and how you, make sure that they're happy and how they're engaged with the team, and these things, which are questions that were just never there before. So it really has made quite a difference in terms of the way we think about the way we manage our broader business across those wider things. Absolutely not non-financial, but even going to the extreme of, are our people happy, which is very nice. So I suppose a key thing that naturally follows from this is that this is great, but we do need to report something, and we do need to show people stuff, and people need to be able to see how we're doing. So Neil, what sort of things are you seeing from the sort of reporting side of stuff?
Yeah, you're absolutely right, Paul. I'm going to kind of play to your strength here and talk about data, because it's absolutely fundamental in all of this. And I guess if I relate it back to a UK corporate reform piece, you know, a lot of what we've been talking about today, but also what's out there in the market in terms of position papers, it's all quite theoretical. And, you know, it's a language I'm hearing from people. It's quite nebulous to some, especially who haven't come from a risk or a control background, and it doesn't come easy to them. And actually what we've said to organizations, what I'm doing is trying to translate some of that into something that's more data rich, to really help companies understand and have some real data points in front of them to really recognize, you know, where are the gaps and where can they do things differently. So on here is one example of what we're doing around this health check tool in terms of helping companies understand, using the COSO framework, one of our good friends, and understanding the current state of their control or environment and their risk framework. And it really starts to open up some interesting questions, because what you start to see here as an example for a company is that actually information and communication has been pretty good. And the tone from the top and all those things that we typically see in a framework have been very good. And especially around the time of COVID as well, we've seen that kind of accentuated more, everything to what Socrates said in terms of people asking about well-being and all those questions we never really asked or really fell to the bottom of the agenda. But then when you look at this, interestingly, control monitoring and your risk assessment is still pretty poor. It's not yet there. And actually, this is kind of the place where we're looking at organizations to try to beef up what they're doing, especially when you go back to the comment that I said around Bryden and his focus on fraud risk assessments, and really having to build that into whatever processes you have. And linking it back to what Heather said, you know, this isn't just about slapping it into an organization. It's what works best for your organization in that culture, in that organizational structure, because what works for one may not be working for another. But in order to do that, you need to have some good data. And that's what we're seeing companies start thinking about. To your point, Paul, you know, UK corporate reform is a fantastic opportunity to think about the data lineage and the data journey for companies. You know, how does that drive improvement? And actually, when I go back to your original question, Paul, about tools and technology as well, you know, tools like Power BI, you know, this time last year, were we really using it in the way we were? I would say no, especially from my perspective, but they're the tools that we're starting to use more to drive better data visualization to help organizations make more informed decisions.
So no, that's great. It's the world would not be right without some good reporting, and as you say, Power BI has really suddenly become a lot more popular than it was before. So, and I suppose, Heather, at a practical level, what sort of tools and technologies are you looking at to help with this particular challenge?
Yeah, I guess, wow, there are so many tools and processes and technologies available. You know, it really is like going into a shop. I think for me, the key thing is keep it simple and aligned to your own outcomes. I'm not a technology whiz by any stretch of the imagination. So, you know, for me, I need something that is going to be able to be used. But one thing I've also realised is that we've learned a lot about technology during COVID. And one of the things I'm quite conscious of is whatever we've done to change our processes to allow them to work remotely, certainly I found that in many cases we've been able to streamline and make a lot of effectiveness and efficiency in the way that we do things through doing that. And so making sure that whatever it is that you've learned and done through COVID, that if there are some really good things, don't throw them away when we return to a non-COVID world, because actually I think there's some great things that all of us will probably have picked up with tools and processes. I think for me, in terms of framework processes, we run a lot of hours through the Office 365 suite, and Power BI is part of that suite, which is great, and looking at that. And that's definitely provided us with numerous opportunities, and particularly increasing collaboration across all the different areas. So you can really get from ownership through the different lines of assurance using those tools. For enterprise risk management, we use Magique, which gives some really useful dashboards and reporting options at different levels of detail. So again, you know, when you're the risk owner, you can see every bit of detail that you want to your heart's content, but it provides some really high level, good dashboards that we can use with the audit committee and through the board, whilst having it all within one system. So, but I recognise that different people, again, are in different places, and you have to look at where you are on your journey and move that forward. I'm in a process at the moment where I'm also experimenting with robotics and AI. And looking at that and how can we use that in some of the non-financial data. I know that through talking to colleagues that work in the financial services sector, that there's a huge amount that's used there, particularly, you know, in their internal audit divisions. It's very different applying that to your high volume replicable processes on your data there from when you're doing it on non-financial data that's going through. But we are seeing that there are elements. But again, a key learning for me there is you've got to get the data right in the first place. You know, putting robotics in when your underlying data isn't there and your underlying processes and systems aren't there doesn't work. So, you know, definitely it's about applying what's right and having that journey again. I think from a process point of view, though, rather than just the technology point of view, I mentioned it earlier very much about the alignment and giving that forward look to your board in particular, but also using that in the way that you develop it as a risk professional and going through. So I'm really keen on making sure that we look at our risks from both a bottom up and top down perspective, but also from a forward back point of view, because I think you can do the top down and bottom up, but if you don't look at it in forward back, then you can really miss some of the opportunities and other risks, but also some of the opportunities to get things right first time. So I think, and get the engagement in early. So that's one of the key things for me in terms of processes, which isn't about your tools and technologies, it's more about a mindset. And I think mindset is equally as important as the technology.
Yeah, that mindset point is really interesting, because if I look at the last year and I look at, you know, within EY, our attempts to get collaboration working through Office 365 in the same way as you, know, the take up was quite difficult. You know, everybody was still very much in their traditional, I do a spreadsheet here and I do a PowerPoint there. But you know, this COVID has really forced us to say, well, actually, we need to work together on this stuff, and oh, there's actually some really good collaboration capability here, and we can all share a document and we can all edit it and we can all see it. And so I think I think personally we've all been on quite an interesting and useful journey over this time, that, as you say, as you said earlier, we really do need to keep going, and we do need to build on, because it is the way to address some of the points that you made, Socrates, about we need to work together more, we need to be more transparent about what's going on and sharing in that information better. So I suppose just to close this down then, it'd be good just to get a last view from each of you in terms of something that you think our audience should just take away as from your personal point of view. What's the thing you'd like them to look at? Neil, do you want to kick off?
Yeah, no, absolutely, Paul. I guess, as I said earlier on, you know, we're entering this consultation period around UK corporate reform. And I think if I reflect on that, one thing is for sure, something is going to change from our risk and control perspective. Those societal expectations that I talked about earlier, they're not going away. And actually, as we see more of these corporate governance, internal controls and risk management failures or problems in the market, you know, it's going to only accelerate momentum to do something. And actually, if you then pair that up with the other comment made earlier about audit committee chairs asking the questions of all of us as risk and control professionals, what are we actually doing? There feels a need that we need to start moving forward. And as I said earlier, I think some of the things that we are seeing is people thinking about scoping, really understanding, you know, what's the size and scale of my organization? Where are the key risks in my organization? Where is the current state of my control environment, whether it's a health check or another tool, but really starting to get an overview. And I think the one encouragement I'm giving organizations is really try to get your hands around the IT landscape and the data piece that, Paul, you love so much, but it's so important that we actually understand that now more than ever as we move forward into UK corporate reform. Because my final point, Paul, would be, you know, if I look at US SOX and what happened there, you know, that was really thrust upon management at the time. And I would say quite strongly that with little pragmatism in terms of its application. And actually, we now have the benefit of hindsight, and we've got a timeline around this consultation to really think about what we need and what fits best for our organisation. My strong encouragement is to really use this time effectively to plan, but also engage and talk to your businesses about this so that people aren't surprised when this does come down the line.
Thank you, Neil. So Heather, from the point of view of a head of group compliance and assurance, what would you be saying?
Well, actually, my first point I was going to say is what Neil said as his last point: plan early. So I think there is, I am all about planning, but it's, do that gap analysis of where you are now and against where you think you're going to need to be, and set your journey plan, because there are probably a number of no regret areas that are right for yourself and your business that you think, and whether or not they are required when we finally know what the landscape looks like, there are probably some really good things that actually are great for your individual culture and company that you can just plan on it and get going on ready. So I think that's one of the things, is do that planning early. I'd also say keep your plan real when you're presenting it to, whether it's to the exec, whether it's to the audit committee and board, but keep it real. And I think one of the things for me is, you can do your plan and you can have those rose-tinted spectacles of everything that you can deliver, and whether you want to have everything documented behind all your data, but can you really deliver it all in 12 months? So I think have a look at it and apply your own risk-based techniques that you apply to your data to your own plan, and think about where do I want to target my plan first, and to accept that it's going to be a journey. As I said, in the water sector, we've been on this journey for 6 years, and it certainly was a good 3 years before I would say that we were, I felt really like we had uncovered a lot of the systematic approach with the documentation that we now have and that rigor behind it. It wasn't all done in 1 year. And I think the third thing is be brave. Think, how can you do it differently? How would your non-risk audit colleague think about doing this? How would you look at it through that different way, and just be brave with thinking about what you're going to do? COVID has forced us all to be brave, as I said earlier, with applying different things. Just challenge yourself to do that even more.
Thank you, Heather. And Socrates, from a NED's point of view.
So great segue, Heather. Thank you very much. So COVID has really been the moment when real culture has crystallized. Every one of us has seen that happen, so positively or negatively. So let's focus on the positive angles. Staff, as we discussed earlier, can actually now see the corporate values of the organization that they belong to. And that gives confidence to the board. So if those positive corporate values have been upheld and they've made it through the crisis, the new world coming down the pipe provides them the opportunity that they do have the tools, they do have the processes, they do have the right culture to deal with whatever comes their way. So whether it be the UK corporate reform, that shouldn't be too much of a worry. So I'm giving a positive spin to end my speech. Thank you very much for that.
Perfect. Thank you, Socrates. So I think my very, very short summary would be, as Neil said, something will change. As Heather said, let's be ready for that. And as Socrates said, get the people around it and we'll be fine. So thank you very much, fellow panelists. It's been really good fun for me, and I'm going to hand back to Chris.
Thank you very much, Paul, and thank you very much to all our panelists. We have put aside some time for questions and answers, for questions from the floor. So I haven't seen any questions come through the session yet. If anyone does have any questions out there they'd like to ask our wonderful panel here, the next couple of minutes, please do feel free to send them through on chat. I'm sure we're all eager to answer any queries you do have. I feel like an auctioneer here.
That's why we need one of those musical moments, don't we? Pretend we're in an elevator for a few minutes. We can all have our own.
I would offer, raining enough as it is.
Very good.
Yeah, so put the countdown theme on to increase the pressure. Any questions from anyone? Is everyone delighted with the message they've had today? Looks like we've managed to keep everyone fully informed and give everyone the information they needed. Last chance for anyone? Any last questions? I really am going into auction mode here, aren't I? I should have stopped that.
I'm imagining the countdown clock as you say this, actually. It's
I am too. It's running through my head.
Yeah. Feel the increased tension of Chris as we get closer to the 30 seconds. That's good.
Absolutely.
Okay. Looks like we've given everyone the information we need today. So That's that. Thank you very much to all. I'd like to thank all our attendees for coming along today. Hope you've got as much out of it as I have. I think it's been a very, very informative session and a great sign of how we can still carry on running these forums, still carry on with this information, dealing with changes, even at difficult times when we're not allowed to all meet in person. So thank you very much indeed to our panelists and our chair, to Neil, to Paul, to Socrates, to Heather, to my organising committee, and to everyone for attending. For attendees, we will be sending a survey around to gather your thoughts on how this morning's gone, on what you'd like to see in the future, and what you thought. And of course, as I said at the start, the session has been recorded, so it will be fully available online afterwards. Thank you all very much again for an excellent session, and goodbye.
Thank you.
Thank you.